So in this lecture, we're going to talk about measurement. Specifically, we're going to talk about reliability and validity. So to give you a rundown of today's agenda, we'll talk about different types of measurement. Then we'll talk about different types of measurement scaling. Then we'll talk about what reliability is and different forms of reliability. And then we'll talk about validity and different types of validity. So as we talked about in our last lecture, we have two broad types of variables, conceptual variables and operational variables. Now the conceptual variables are those broad abstract ideas that we want to explore in our research. The operational variables are how we actually measure those conceptual variables in a study. Because remember, the conceptual variables cannot be directly tested, so you have to have some concrete way of measuring those conceptual variables in your study. And that's how we end up having operational variables, the ways of being able to measure the conceptual variables of interest in a study. Now, the purpose of measurement is to allow us to operationalize a conceptual variable so that we can assign numbers to represent the values for each of the possible values of that variable. So we're going to use this running example for the rest of the class. How could you measure the conceptual variable anxiety in a study? And I'm going to give you 3 steps in measuring a conceptual variable. The first step is to operationally define that variable. The second step is to test for reliability. And the third step is to test for validity. We'll go through each of those 3 steps. So step 1, operationally defining a variable. So the first thing we need to do is operationalize anxiety. And the question is, how are we going to decide to operationalize anxiety? A couple different ways we can do it. We can use a self-report measure of anxiety. We could try to manipulate anxiety by putting some people in a stressful context, so one that will induce anxiety, or in a non-stressful context, so a context that won't induce anxiety. We could observe and record how fidgety someone is and use fidgety as kind of a proxy for anxiety. Or we could use more physiological responses by looking at someone's heart rate or their cortisol levels, with the idea being that the higher their heart rate or the higher their cortisol levels, the more stressed or anxious they are. And what I want to do next is talk about 4 different types of measures. So you have self-report measures, tests, behavioral measures, and physical, or oftentimes called physiological measures. So self-report measures are what they sound like. People are self-reporting either how they think, feel, or act. So I tried to make it into an acronym for you. So we have the first one is affective self-report. So you ask people how they are feeling. Affect is about emotions, about feelings, right? So you can give them a scale that measures their anxiety level or their level of depression. Those are all affective self-report measures. So that's the A in our acronym here. The B is a behavioral self-report. And this is where you ask people what they do, right? So how often do you exercise? How many hours do you study, right? These are all things that people are doing. You're asking them to report that. And then the C is cognitive self-report measures. This is when you're asking people what they think. So you can ask them to report about how they feel about the protests or about bans on guns. The second type are tests. Now, tests are individual difference measures in regards to a particular content area. So oftentimes you'll think about personality tests, right? So if you're taking personality psychology, you might know about the Myers-Briggs personality test or the ink blot test. These are all tests that are trying to look at individual differences on personality. We also have ability tests. And these are tests to look at individual differences on someone's ability in a particular domain. And within an ability test, we have what are called achievement tests. So these are tests designed to measure someone's present competence in a domain. So if you're taking a quiz in a class or an exam in a class, those are achievement tests. They're trying to assess your present knowledge or understanding of a particular content. In contrast, aptitude tests are trying to look at your potential in a particular domain. So you could think about the SAT or the ACT or the GRE, any kind of standardized test are trying to assess someone's potential in a particular domain. So, for example, the SAT is designed to look at people's or students' grades their first year in college, right? So those are aptitude tests. They're trying to predict future behavior or a future outcome. Our third type are behavioral measures. This is when you are observing people's behavior and then you're carefully recording and documenting that behavior. So, example I often give is you're watching children in the playground and you're seeing how often they act aggressively, and you decide ahead of time how you're going to measure aggression. Is it going to be hitting, kicking, biting, and those kinds of things? And then you're going to just document how frequently those particular behaviors occur in that naturalistic context. Now, one of the problems with behavioral measures is that people don't always act naturally when they know they're being observed. So if you are going to use a behavioral measure, you want to make sure that you're observing them in a way in which they don't know or don't really recognize that they're being observed. Another way to get around this concern about reactivity or concerns about people acting unnaturally when they're being observed is to use either what's called a physical or physiological measure. So these are measures of bodily activity that people cannot easily control. So things like heart rate, blood pressure, cortisol levels. These are all things that the body will respond to, but you can't easily control them. So I can't easily tell my cortisol levels to go down. So they're going to be less affected by reactivity. So now let's talk about measurement scaling. So as we discussed before, variables by definition must have more than one value, right? They're not constant, so they have to have the ability to take on more than one value. So measurement scaling characterizes how variables are measured and how we assign numeric values to these different variables. There are 4 different types of measurement scales: nominal scales, ordinal scales, interval scales, and ratio scales. And as I go through the different types of scales, I want you to try to recognize that for each type, I'm adding one new level of complexity to the previous type. And I'll try to highlight that as I go through it. So nominal scales are when you assign individual objects to a category, and the numeric values or properties you assign to those particular categories is arbitrary. Right, so the example I have here, I have Democrats, and I can assign them a 1, I can assign independents 2, and Republicans 3. The numbers that I assign to these different groups don't really matter. So I could have assigned Democrats 2, independents 3, and Republicans 1, and it would still have made sense. So the numbers I assign to the different values don't really matter. So that's the key thing to remember here, is that for nominal variables, nominal scaling, the numeric values that I assign to any possible value doesn't really matter, right? So again, if you go with gender, I can give males 0, females 1, or I can give females 0, males 1, and the meaning of those numbers does not change. Now, in contrast to nominal scales, ordinal scales, objects or individuals are categorized in terms of rank order. So now the order in which you assign numeric values to the different possible values that are there matter, right? So let's say I have first place, second place, third place. Most likely what I want to do is I want to assign a 1 to first place, a 2 to second place, or a 3 to third place, because the first place person is ahead of the second place person. Second place person is ahead of the third place person. So the order in which I assign numeric values to these different outcomes has importance and meaning to it. So I can't just randomly assign values or numbers like I did with nominal data, right? So now if I give first place a 3 and second place a 1 and third place a 2, it loses the actual meaning behind the different values here. So I want to make sure that the order in which I assign numeric values to the different outcomes captures the fact that there's an ordering to it. So think about grades. If I wanted to assign numeric values to grades, I can give A's a 4, B's a 3, C's a 2, D's a 1, F is 0, right? So now higher scores means that you did better. And again, you want to make sure that whatever system you use, the numbers accurately represent the possible values and the ordering of those values. Now, interval scales are similar to ordinal scales, except now the intervals between your possible values is constant, which is why it's called interval scales. The distances between your values is now held constant. And importantly, for interval scales, a value of 0 does not mean the absence of whatever you're measuring. And as a result, you cannot form a ratio out of interval scales. So let me give you an example of an interval scale. So let's go with Fahrenheit, right? So Fahrenheit, the distance between 40 degrees and 41 degrees is the same as the distance between 41 degrees and 42 degrees. So the distance between all the possible outcomes is constant. But importantly, a temperature of 0 degrees Fahrenheit does not mean the absence of heat. Now, it indicates that it's cold outside, but you can get temperatures below 0, right? So because 0 does not mean the absence of what you're measuring, you can't form a ratio out of it. So when you talk about interval scales, you can't form ratios out of those particular scalings because 0 does not mean the absence of what you're measuring. Now, ratios are similar to interval scales, except 0 does mean the absence of what you're measuring, right? So if I say I have $0, that means I have no money. And as a result, when you have a scale in which 0 means the absence of what you're measuring, you can now form ratios out of different values, right? So if one person has $50 and the other person has $100, you can now say it's a 1-to-2 ratio. The first person has half of what the other person has, right? So because you can form that ratio, that helps you understand that you have a ratio scale. So the key here is the difference between a ratio scale and an interval scale is that for a ratio scale, 0 means the absence of what you're measuring.